So to start out with, I want an all over coat of the Steel Legion drab anywhere there's horse flesh. I already have a lot of this painted just to save a little bit of time. The undercoat, the priming of this horse is gray sear, but honestly any color could work here because we're working with opaque paints as opposed to contrast paints or speed paints, which are more translucent. However, just keep in mind we're making a tan horse, it's fairly light, so if you start from a pure black, you might have to do more layers. We just want to be a little careful around the face, around the leather, around the cloth of the comparison, because if we get in with this paint we have to clean it up and it's just going to slow us down a little bit. Some people like to paint one thing at a time. Other people, kind of like me, like to do a little bit of the cloth, a little bit of flesh all at once and just build it up together. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, do what's ever comfortable, but just keep in mind that if you're painting other things at the same time you're doing the flesh, you have to be more careful and more precise with your paints. Once that's dry, we're going to follow up with an all-over wash of the Seraphim Sepia. This is going to give you a nice, warm, dark tone into the shadows of this horse's flesh. And after we add a couple layers of highlights on, it's going to add a real nice amount of depth to the model. This is a real standard wash technique here, nothing fancy. Try to get it in all the nooks and crannies. Don't let it blob up anywhere and leave kind of ugly stains. So just be precise and careful. Don't get in a rush and just get a nice all over layer of this really wonderful wash. And of course, don't forget the inside of the horse's legs. Once that dries, we're going to go over the model with Talarn sand, however you say it. That's one of those weird GW words. For this step, we really want to hit every raised part of the horse flesh on this model. So this is not quite an edge highlight, we're actually hitting a lot more than that. We're hitting all these raised spots everywhere all over the flesh, and at the end of it you should see a little bit that Seraphim Sepium at the very deep recesses, and just a little bit of that original Steel Legion drab. So the flesh of this horse is starting to get actually pretty interesting. We have a little bit of variations in shades of tan. It's looking a lot more organic, a lot more natural, and we still have one more highlight to go. I'm sure you've also noticed that I've done quite a bit of the rest of the horse in between cuts of this video. I'm using a 3-color checkerboard here. This is the first time I've done that. Kind of liking how it turned out. Obviously it's out of the scope of this video, but if you're curious in how I did this kind of checkerboard, I have another video where I go over just how to do that. I'm going to speed up the video here a little bit just so I don't completely bore you, but this step is something I do very slow and very carefully and very deliberate to not overbrush where we want this highlighted color. It's really hard to fix the recesses once you get a bright color in there, and it comes with practice, but just be very careful you only put this color where you want to put it. The eyes can prove to be a little tricky. Just make sure you use a small brush, just a little bit of paint. And really, if all you can get is just a little bit on the upper eyelid of the model, it will go a long way. That's plenty. Be happy with that. Otherwise, you know, you're going to hit the top eyelid, a little bit of the lower eyelid, and then if you have your shading in there from the Seraphim Sepia, it'll really take care of the eye to where you don't quite put in the work of making an actual eye on the horse, but with those combinations of colors and the shading, it ends up looking pretty decent. While that dries, I'm going to work on the tail, starting with a base coat of Zandai dust. I'm giving this horse what in the real world would be called a flax gene, which is basically means you have a light hair color compared to a much darker body hair. You might have heard a horse called flaxen before. It basically just means a horse that has white or really blonde hair. It's a relatively rare gene, so I wouldn't do it on a lot of horses, but it is kind of nice to add it to a horse every now and then to kind of break up, you know, the color of your lance formations or whatever you're building. But as far as this actual paint job goes, Zendai is a really nice color. It covers well. You might have to do a few more coats if you have a black base to start with, but if you started with gray or white, 1 or 2 coats ought to do it. Next, I'm going to hit the tail with a really heavy dry brush, this Ushabti bone. I'm using a real ratty old brush here. A cheap makeup brush is really good for dry brushing if you don't have one yet. Otherwise, use an old brush because the method does kind of mess with your bristles, and I would kind of, you know, put whatever brush you use aside and use it only for dry brushing. But the point here is have a real easy, real lazy way to hit the higher points of these strands of hair in the back to make it look like a more realistic blonde. And then once that's dry, I'm back with this Seraphim Sepia, and I'm going to give a fairly light, maybe medium wash of this color over the blonde tail. This is going to add some lowlights and also help blend the Ushabti bone and the Zendai dust together, so it looks more natural and transitions easier between the high and the low. Then for the last part of this tail, I'm going to hit it one more time with a highlight of this Ushabti bone, doing only the very highest points of this tail, the ones you think they'll get the absolute most reflection of light. And then we are back to the body of the horse where we're hitting it with our final highlight of Karak Stone. Now this color is quite a bit lighter than the other colors we've used for this horse flesh, so you really want to use it sparingly. I'm using a very small brush here, and honestly for the most part I am just going to hit these individual strands of hair where his, you know, leg meets his hooves to make those pop out a little bit more. There are other parts of the flesh you might consider using this color on, maybe the tips of his ears, maybe, you know, the very high point of his lips or the high point of his legs where his muscle stands out. Really that's your call. See, I do use it just a little bit on the leg here, but the point is I'm not using this color a lot. It is a color I use very sparingly just to bring a highlight to a few points. We don't want to get this color all over. That's it for the horse, and hopefully by the time you're finished, you end up with something like this. Again, to save time, I have skipped over the first layer, which is Rhinox hide, where I did all over the horse flesh. Now I'm going to follow up with this Doom Bull Brown on most of the raised areas, just leaving the Rhinox hide in the most deepest recesses of the flesh. The Rhinox hide, along with some wash, is going to make up the lowlights of the model, the deepest recesses, and this Doom Bull Brown is basically going to be our mid-tone for the model. I'm going to speed up the video at this point to keep this from getting boring, but basically this is pretty standard. I'm going through all the legs, I'll do the face, the underside of the body, and we're just avoiding the lowest of lows in the model and getting all the raised areas. Very similar to what we did in the first horse. When we're done, this is going to give us kind of a dark brown look. If this is the way you want to paint your horses rather than the first methods I showed, which is mostly contrast, this will probably be your default horse. At least in my opinion, this dark brown or a black is probably best for, you know, a realistic war horse. Once that is dry, we're going to follow up with some Agrax Earthshade all over the horse flesh. So right now I have a nice two-tone of the Rhinox and the Doombull Brown, and this is just going to help add some shading. It's going to blend the two colors together, which is kind of an added bonus here, but mostly what we need this for is just going to darken our lowlights a little bit more and just add a more dynamic, more natural look by the time we finish the horse. So I'm doing a fairly heavy dry brush here, but I am being careful not to let it pull too much in areas I don't want to pull. Agrax Earthshade has a habit of drying kind of shiny, but not to panic. You can always go with the clear coat, a matte clear coat, and really if you want to preserve the paint job of your models, you should be doing that anyways. But if you end up with some extra shine, you know, from the wash, the matte overcoat you should be doing anyways will clean that right up. Definitely give that time to dry, but once it is dry, we're going to do another highlight of this Doombull Brown. So just like before, we're hitting all the raised areas of this model, but we're doing it less so with this coat than we did the one before. So when we're done, we're going to be left with 3 different tones on these legs and face, right? You'll have the dark areas with the Rhinox and the Earthshade on top of it. You'll have the Doombull Brown as the next layer that's been darkened with the Agrax Earthshade and blended. And then you'll have this highlight of this pure Doombull Brown on top of that. Again, all 3 different colors kind of coming together. That just adds a lot of depth and definition to, you know, the ridges, the ups and downs of the plastic on this horse. That was just a really long-winded way of saying it'll look good. All I'm trying to say is by doing this layer and having these different shades, it's going to look better than if you just slap some Doombull Brown and some wash over it. For our very last layer of paint on this flesh, we're going to pull out the Deathclaw Brown. This brown is obviously quite a bit lighter than the rest of the model. We only want to use this sparingly where we really want the model to pop. So I'm using it here on, you know, the strands of hair that stands out right above his hooves, the tips of his ears. You might do the edges of his nose, the high point of his lip, etc. Sparingly, just at the very highest points that you just kind of want to make pop and separate from the rest of the model. This kind of bright highlight on top of these darker colors would probably look pretty terrible if we were painting something bigger, but due to the small size of these Warhammer models, this bright highlighting just really helps things stand out, and so your eyes just don't muddle all the details together, if that makes sense. which is really the point of edge highlighting if you didn't know. I mean, the whole idea behind it is it's just something you do for really small models to help the details to pop out a little bit more than what our eyes would naturally allow it to do on this scale. The tail I'm going to do different than normal just to show some new techniques. I'm going to start with the dry brush of this Corvus Black. And this is going to be the heaviest dry brush I do. And basically what I'm going to do is keep on dry brushing, going, up a color each time until I get to my final highlight. Then I'm going to follow up on that with a lighter high brush of this Eshin Gray. If you've never dry brushed before, there's plenty of videos on YouTube for it, but basically I'm just using a mostly dry brush to run over my object, which will only leave paint on the highlighted areas. And of course, my final and highest highlight is going to be this Dawnstone. This dry brush, I'm doing the least amount of paint of all of them. A good trick is to rub a little bit on your actual skin and see how much paint it leaves off. And then once you're ready, just one last final dry brush on the tail, and the flesh of this horse is good to go, and it's just waiting for me to paint the rest of them. And at the end, you should end up with something like this. So here I'm starting out with an all over coat of Dawnstone. But that's really because I'm starting with a gray base. If you're starting with a black base, you might want to start with an all over coat of Eshin Gray just to give a transition color. It's just going to be hard to cover black with Dawnstone. But if you're like me and you're using a lighter toned base, you could start off with just Dawnstone and do just fine. This is really no different than the other two horses that we've done together. We just want to get an all over nice easy coat, and it's going to work as our mid-tone for the rest of the model. Once that's dry, we do an all over wash with Agrax Earthshade. I'm going to skip that for this video to try to save a little bit of time, but this is just like the wash we did on the other models. Just want a nice even coat, careful to not allow pooling. Once that's done, we end up with this lovely dark tone for the low points of our model, and then we're just going to cover up all these high points with Administratum Gray because GW refuses to use normal words. I get that GW does a lot to protect their IP, but we don't really have to Latinify every single word. Anyways, if you watch the other two horse sections, you kind of know the drill here. We're going to hit the higher points of this model. We're going to leave the Dawnstone underneath and the Agrax Earthshade so it kind of shines through, but these high points are going to be covered in this Administratum Gray. I actually find this color from GW a little frustrating. It does not cover well for the most part, but if you're doing, gray on gray, it actually works really well in situations like this. Remember to take your time when doing the face details. Really want small, precise lines. As far as the eyes, hit the upper eyelid, hit the lower eyelid, let that darker gray shine through for the pupil. If you're not going to do them, I never paint the eyeballs in my miniatures. It's one of those things where if you do them right, it only adds a little bit. If you do the eye wrong, it completely destroys the model. I think most of us, for the most part, are better off just doing eyes with a little bit of shading like I do here. And honestly, miniatures with good eyes are super rare. I've seen a lot of posts on Reddit where people do eyes, and most of them just really take away from the model. Anyways, once you're done with this step, it should look something similar to this, and then we're ready to move on to the last highlight. So for this last highlight, I'm actually doing a mix of 50/50 Uthuan Gray and Administratum Gray. Pure Uthuan Gray was just a little too close to white for my taste, and I still needed a color to make some of these finer details pop. So I ended up doing a 50/50 of these two colors, and it turned out pretty well. Feel free to apply this highlight all over the model, anywhere you can find the line. Just make sure it's thinner, than the previous highlight you did, so that previous color shines through as well. You also probably noticed that I've done some of the heraldry, the barding, the comparison, whatever you want to call it, on this horse already. You could do that while you do the flesh, before you do the flesh. It really doesn't matter. Like, the order you paint things is really up to you as a painter. I like to do things concurrently sometimes to just help break up the monotony rather than doing just one thing over and over again. But I would say for the most part, at least starting out, you should try to paint inside in the very deepest parts of the model and then go up to the layers above. So in this case, this would be the hooves, then the flesh, then the cloth, then the leather, and then the metal on top of the leather. But you might find a different order works for you, and hey, that's great. I also realized the colors I'm using here are super unorthodox for the heraldry, with the black and the pink. Obviously that's far outside of what would be acceptable in normal heraldry rules, but hey, it's a fantasy setting and I paint a lot of knights and I'd like to make them stand out. So I thought for these questing knights I'd use a little bit of alternative colors just to break things up a little bit. And honestly, I think the end result with that black and pink looks really good. For this horse, I'm doing one final edge highlight of pure Uthuan Gray. Really use this a little sparingly. We just want to hit the highest areas, the tufts of fur near his hooves, maybe the tips of his ears, highlight on his nose, just things, the real fine details you want to make pop a little bit. But just be sure to use it sparingly. If you apply it everywhere, it's just going to kind of lose its effect. But that's the final highlight for this horse. If you want to see how I did the tail, go back and look at the brown horse. I use the exact same method. But at the end, following this guy, you'll end up with a horse that looks like this. As a bit of a bonus, this is how I do gray hair. If you want to do a gray mane on your horse, I start with a base of Celestra Gray, and I just cover it all over, the hair. And then you want to follow up on that with a wash. I'm using Nuln Oil here. Obviously, you could also do Agrax Earthshade or even Seraphim Sepia. It'll give you slightly different tones of gray. You can do some experimenting, but you just need to get some kind of a wash to help with those low lights. And then we follow up on that with a highlight of Uthuan Gray, to where we just want to pick out these individual strands inside the mane and just have a nice smooth edge highlight on them. And once that's finished, that's pretty much it. There you have a nice, easy to do gray mane. So between the original video and this is the extent of how I paint horses. If there's another technique for another kind of horse that you haven't seen in these videos, let me know in the comments. I'd actually love to check it out.